Delighted that you're here, and I hope you've got your Bible with you, and I encourage you to turn to the book of Colossians. We have visitors. We're glad that you've come and hope you can come back and be with us again. We announced this morning that we would be looking at the book of Colossians, begin a thorough study of the book of Colossians. Typically in our survey through the Bible that we're doing in our Bible classes, when we get to the book of Colossians, we'll only take 4 weeks, cover a chapter a week. So this, we intend to be a little more thorough than that. And so hopefully this afternoon, as we mentioned this morning, if you were not here, then you need to hear this, that I've issued a challenge that you might read the book of Colossians, the whole book, before tonight, and each time before we go through our study each week. It's a short book. It's only 4 chapters, 95 verses, less than 2,000 words. The average reader could read it in about 15 minutes. So I would encourage you before next time to read the entire book. And then the next time, read the entire book. And by the time we get through, your familiarity with the book, I think, will be greatly enhanced. This is our plan of study for the next few weeks. We're going to have 13 lessons. That sounds like a lot for a short book. But we're going to take segments at a time. For example, next time we'll talk about the thanks for the Colossians. What do we learn from that? And then the prayer for the Colossians. And then we'll talk about the preeminent Christ and on down the line. We'll say more about that lineup a little bit later. As always, when we study any book of the Bible, I think it's imperative that we give introductory information. Otherwise, we're like having a study of a book that we know very little about before we begin the study of the book. And it's like having a conversation with someone that you don't even know who they are. A little introduction enhances our understanding of that. This is a book that exalts the preeminent Christ like no other. If you're interested in the preeminent Christ, if you're a Christian, you are interested in that. There is not another book that exalts him more than this book. Now, there may be equals to that, but none exalt him anymore. Then the book turns from that, having exalted the Christ, and tells us how to live in service to him. And we're going to see things about our attitude. We'll see things about our language, the treatment of others, our worship in the home, and our conduct on the job. Not to name everything there. And if you read through the book this afternoon sometime, then you saw those matters. You saw, I remember something about how we treat others, worship in the home and the family, and how we conduct ourselves on the job. And yes, how we use our language, what we say, and our attitudes toward others. So there's a great deal of information before us in the study of this book. Let's start by looking at the city of Colossae. The city of Colossae was a Phrygian city in Asia Minor. The location of the city is here, as you see on this map, in that circle. That is the city of Colossae, which is now in modern Turkey. And so that's where the city of Colossae would be, or is, and was. It was a part of the triplet cities, as some have referred to them, that were located on the Lycus River, where it joined the Meander River. And all 3 cities are mentioned here in this book. We have these 3 cities, and this is from Logos maps, and that doesn't really give us a perspective of their relationship to each other, which I'll mention in just a moment. But Laodicea, for example, is mentioned in chapter 4 and 13. If you care to turn over there and just take a look, I'm not going to read that. Verse 16 mentions Laodicea. 4 and 13 mentions Hierapolis, and chapter 1 and verse 2 mentions Colossae. Hierapolis and Laodicea were about 6 miles apart, and 12 miles away would be Colossae. That's not depicted completely here on this map. And then to the west, about 100 miles, would be the city of Ephesus. So that gives you a little bit of the location of the cities. What do we know about the economy of the city? And why is that important? Well, if the city is thriving, then it's a place where people would traffic, and there would be a place for the spread of the gospel. Well, these 3 cities that we just mentioned prospered in the sale of wool due to the rich pasture land in the Lycus Valley. And so they did prosper for a while. Barclay observes that the chalky waters there, due to volcanic activity, were suitable for dyeing cloth. Linsky speaks of a deep blue dye that was available through that. Colossae became famous for its trade in a certain dye, and it came to be called by the name of the city. And so it was a city that in time had prospered, or over time it prospered in the cell as well as the other two cities of this diet. What do we know about the population of the city? Well, it was predominantly, because it being in Asia Minor, it was predominantly Gentile in population. We see that in chapter 1, in verse 21. They had been converted from being aliens, and he mentions Gentiles in chapter 1 and in verse 27. So it's predominantly Gentile. There were Jews there as well. In fact, quite a number of Jews. There were Jews that were present at Pentecost in Acts 2 that were from Phrygia. This is that region. I don't mean they were from Colossae necessarily, but could have been. There were Jews there from Phrygia. The Jewish historian Josephus tells of Antiochus III transporting some 2,000 Jews from Babylonia and Mesopotamia to Lydia and Phrygia in the 2nd century BC. And some, as Barclay observes, estimate that there was as many as 50,000 Jews that were in the area by 62 AD. And so there were Jews there as well as Gentiles, predominantly Gentiles, but it was a heavy population of Jews as well. But there was the demise of the city. We see it seems to be a city that had grown and had prospered and has the sale of a product that is available that makes for the city to grow and become quite prosperous. But there was the demise of the city. Most scholars think that Laodicea and Hierapolis grew in prominence while Colossae faded somehow. And by the time this letter is sent, it had dwindled in size and also in importance. Shortly after this letter would have been sent, there was an earthquake that destroyed Laodicea, and some think that it did damage to Colossae, perhaps. By the 12th century, the city had disappeared completely, according to William Hendrickson. So what is Colossae like now? Well, you would know Colossae because there's a sign that says Colossae. This is from our own Stephen Smith, who was there in March of this year. And that's about all you have there that indicates it's Colossae. The city has become nothing. This tell, a tell is a mound. This mound is all that's left to be seen today. That's what you see, and that's all there is of Colossae. There's nothing to get out and roam around and see. And so that's the modern day Colossae. It had dwindled down to nothing by the 12th century, and there's still nothing there except a spot that you can see that is historical. Now we're more interested now. We know a little about the city and where this church was located, and the letter that we're reading and going to be studying was sent to the church at Colossae. There's no one there to receive anything anymore, but what about the establishment of the church at Colossae? Well, there's no record of the church being established in the book of Acts. So unlike churches, for example, a letter that was sent to Corinth, we have an establishment record in Acts 18. The church at Ephesus, we have an establishment of that church in Acts 19. And on down the line with various other churches. The church at Philippi, we read about its establishment in Acts 16. We have no record of the church at Colossae being established. We don't have a record of Paul going there and preaching, and multitudes were obedient to the gospel. So that raises some questions about the establishment of the church. Who did that? Was it Paul? The most common view is that Paul did not travel to Colossae and establish the church there. And I agree with that. It probably wasn't Paul. But let's talk about some of the arguments that it wasn't Paul. What would suggest to us that Paul was not the one that was involved in the establishment of the church? Well, take a look at chapter 2, if you will. And in verse 1, he mentioned those of Laodicea, and as many as have not seen my face in the flesh. Well, most agree that that's saying that not only had Laodicea not known his face, but those of Colossae had not seen his face. So Paul said he had not seen them face to face. Well, he would have if he had been there and established the church. And we have no record of Paul going to Colossae or preaching there. We don't have a passage that says that he went. Now listen to Brother Weaver in his commentary. Weaver is an excellent student, and I lean heavily on him through some of the Philippians and Colossians material. He's a very excellent student. He said it's not likely that Paul himself was the first to preach the gospel in the Lycus Valley. He states in Colossians 2:1 that he was not personally acquainted with the churches in that region. He may have passed through Colossae on his third missionary trip in AD 52, but most scholars think that he took a route further to the north based on Acts 19:1. Here Luke says that Paul had passed through the upper coast and came to Ephesus. By the way, he doesn't tell the route, but he just tells us he went through Ephesus. The easiest and most natural way, however, for him to travel from Antioch to Syria to Ephesus would have been for him to go through Tarsus and Derbe and Lystra and Iconium and Antioch and Pisidia and Colossae and Laodicea and on to Ephesus on the main east-west highway. Even though Colossians 2 would rule out Paul as the founder of the church in Colossae, it does not exclude the possibility of him having at least passed through Colossae on this trip. Well, he may have been there. That's the point. But no evidence that he established the church. Now let's talk about some arguments that it was Paul. McKnight argues quite heavily that Paul was the one that established the church there. And here's his arguments. It's basically based upon conjecture. And he says that it was Paul's custom to go directly to great cities in the heathen lands. And he did go through Asia, as we see in Acts chapter 16, in Acts chapter 18, including Phrygia. And that he probably, there's your conjecture, went to Colossae. That was his custom, and therefore he must have went. He argues that Colossians 2 and in verse 1 doesn't refer to the Colossians, but to others. And he argues that simply that what Colossians 2 is saying is that his conflict that he mentions in Colossians 2 and verse 1 that he had was not for them alone, but for others who had not seen his face. Colossae had seen his face, he argues, and he bases that on the wording of the next verse when he mentions there and not your. Now, you can take a look at that and draw your own conclusion. He also argues that there would be the great concern that Paul shows for the Colossians, chapter 1, verses 7 and 8 particularly, that was the kind of relationship that would only exist between the teacher and the converted. So therefore, this must be the man who converted them. Then another argument is that he signs off in his own hand, which would have been something they would have recognized, his own handwriting. So therefore, Paul must be the man. Well, I'm not convinced by that, and I don't know if you are, but that's not a big deal one way or the other. But was it Epaphras? This seems to be the most likely one who may have established the church. If you read this afternoon the book of Colossians, you saw the name Epaphras mentioned a couple of 3 times. And so you may wonder, who is this man and what's this all about? Was it Epaphras? Well, let's talk about some evidence that it may very well have been Epaphras. Let's go to chapter 1 now, and in verse 8, they learned the gospel, the text says, from Epaphras. Now, whether he was the one that established it, you may argue, I think it was Paul, and Epaphras went there, and they learned from him as well. Well, maybe so. But chapter 1, and in Colossians, and in verse 7, he said, you also learned from Epaphras, our dear fellow servant, who is a faithful minister of Christ on your behalf, who also declared to us your love in the Spirit. Well, there's something they learned from him. It seems like he may be the one that taught them the gospel. Now, there is some conjecture here that it's possible that while Paul was at Ephesus for 3 years, that the gospel during that time, according to Acts 19 and in verse 10, the text says that the gospel spread throughout Asia. And it's very possible that he sent Epaphras over there to preach the gospel while he was at Ephesus. That's just 100 miles away. And he may have sent him there while he was preaching and teaching in Ephesus. If that be the case, then it's possible that he could have established churches in Laodicea and Hierapolis. I know there was a church there because of things mentioned in chapter 4. Now, what do we know about Epaphras? Do we know anything about him? Well, the text says that he lived in Colossae, chapter 4, verse 12. It's not that he happened to be there for a little bit, but he lived in Colossae, according to chapter 4 and in verse 12. He was a Greek. He was a faithful and hard worker, according to chapter 1 and in verse 7. And so go to chapter 4, if you will, in verse 12. Epaphras, who is one of you, a servant of Christ, greets you, always laboring fervently for you in prayers. He was a man who cared deeply about the brethren at Colossae. And so he's a faithful, hard worker, and he's zealous. Philemon, verse 23, says he was a prisoner with Paul at Rome, and he is not to be confused with Epaphroditus. Not the same man. This is Epaphras. And so he seems to have, according to chapter 1, come to Paul. Paul, by the way, this is a prison epistle that we'll talk about in a moment. Paul is at Rome in prison, and Epaphras has come to him, and he's come with a report of how well the church at Colossae is doing, and some concerns he has for the brethren at Colossae. There is an error that may have a chance of permeating the church, and you need to know that, Paul, and you need to warn them about that. And so that's what little we know about Epaphras. He does seem to be the one that established the church. So I know something about the city and the establishment of the church. Let's talk about the author of the book and the messenger of the letter that goes to Colossae. What do we know about those two matters? Well, first of all, the author is the Apostle Paul. He mentions himself, chapter 1, Paul, an apostle. Mentions himself again, I, Paul, at verse 23, and he mentions himself again as he signs off with his own hand in chapter 4. And so it seems to be without doubt that Paul is the author of the book, though some think that's forged and he was not the author. What arguments do they make that he was not the author? Well, there are many arguments they make, but here's the two main ones. That the writer uses new vocabulary that's not used in other books. And so as you're reading it, you say, I didn't see anything there. We're talking about some terms that you may find in the original that you don't recognize from other books, that only be found in the book of Colossians. And that doesn't really hold much water because as you may, let's just give an example of a sermon. I may preach a sermon on baptism, and I may preach one on the church, and I may preach one on Christ, and I use very similar language in all of those. But for example, this morning as we dealt with Catholicism, there were some terms that you don't hear in most of my sermons. That doesn't mean I'm not the same person that preached the one on baptism over here. It just means that was a different subject matter. And that's all that would mean here. That's no evidence that Paul did not write. But another argument is that the author, whoever he is, dealt with a second century dogma. And that argument assumes that the dogma is full-fledged and that it had to be written in the second century rather than it being an incipient form of that, which will give evidence that that was the case here in just a moment. Well, let's talk about the messengers. When the letter is received over at Colossae, who brings it to them? And you say, well, that's not important. Well, it was important enough for God to mention it or for the writer to mention it, so at least it's worthy of our notice. So let's go to chapter 4, verses 7 and 8. And he says he sent in Tychicus, who is a beloved brother and faithful servant and fellow servant in the Lord, will tell you of the news about me. He's bringing the letter, and when he gets there, he's going to tell you what's going on here at Rome as I'm in prison. Well, he's sending someone else. Onesimus is going along with him, according to verse 8. He's a faithful and beloved brother. He's coming with him. So these are the messengers. They also carried the book of Philemon and the book of Ephesians, which, by the way, Ephesians is parallel. Now, there are parallel books. Obviously, just stop and footnote. If this was in writing, this would be down here in a footnote. You might have Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There are parallel books, and so you have parallel accounts. But there are books of, for example, Kings and Chronicles that are parallel. And so there's not always a parallel book in the New Testament for every other book, but Ephesians and Colossians are very similar in their message, so that there are numerous parallels, and we'll draw those parallels as we go along. That'll help us in interpretation. When we'll talk about a phrase and we'll say, what does that mean? Well, the parallel account over in Ephesians has a different wording of that, and that's going to help us. And so this parallel book was carried also by these two messengers. Let's talk about the date and the place for that. What do we know about the place where the author was, the circumstance where the author was? Well, the Bible tells us it's written from a Roman prison. This is one of the prison epistles. Chapter 4 and verse 3, he mentions his chains. And then again in verse 18, as he ends the letter, he mentions his chains. So he is in a prison there for 2 years at Rome, and this is one of the prison epistles. Now, other prison epistles would include Ephesians and Philippians and Philemon. And so those also, we often talk about the prison epistles. Well, those are the ones. This is one of them. Colossians is one of them. So written approximately at the same time, and now we understand a little better why Colossians and Ephesians are so parallel. Titus and Timothy, 1 Timothy, are somewhat parallel. And so as we talk about those parallel books. Well, if our understanding of the place be correct, and chapter 4 indicates that we are, then that puts the date of the book about 61 to 62 A.D. This would be in the middle to the last half of his prison stay. So not early in his stay, but somewhere in the middle toward the end of his stay in prison, in his Roman prison, he writes this letter and sends it off by these two messengers to the city or to the church at Colossae. Well, now we're understanding a little more. We know something about the city and how the church may have been established and who the author is and who the messengers were, the date and the place. Now we get down to some things that have to do with interpretation of the book. What about the error refuted? Well, this book is unique in that, for example, you study the book of Romans, you study the book of Galatians, and you say, well, what was the error that was being refuted? Well, it was the error of Judaism, and that's pretty simple to identify. It was kind of a one-source doctrine and pretty simplified of what it involved. But what is going on at Colossae, the error threatening the church, is quite convoluted. And that's why an introduction, I think, is going to be helpful to us. This is a concept that's hard to identify. It's hard to identify. It has become known as the Colossian heresy. And you'll hear if you read from commentaries and you read from things where people are writing about Colossians, they'll talk about the Colossian heresy. Why do they call it Colossian heresy? Because you can't call it Judaism, though it has some form of that. You can't really call it Gnosticism because it does have some form of that, but it involves much more than either of those. Now, so the principles that are refuted are nothing like the errors of Romans and Galatians, for example. Those are a little easier to identify. There is no one element of this doctrine. There's not one single element that you say, the doctrine says this, and that's the point, like Judaism, keep the law and be circumcised. That's pretty much it. That's not the case here. Apparently, Epaphras went to Rome to tell Paul of the developments of the church at Colossae, and he reported about the growth and the progress of the church. You say, how do you know that? Well, chapter 1 says Paul rejoices over that, their growth and their progress and their development. And he's excited about that. The church is doing quite well, as we see in chapter 1, and you remember that from your reading this afternoon. But he also informed him, that is, Epaphras must have informed him about an error that threatened their faith. So by the time you get to the end of chapter 1 and beginning into chapter 2, you're beginning to say, I think there's a problem going on here that Paul needs to address, or is addressing, that he heard about from Epaphras. And so that is what we know as the Colossian heresy. Talk about elements of this doctrine. What are the elements of this doctrine? Well, I want to mention 7. There's not just one point that's refuted in the epistle. In other words, it's not like basically the argument of Galatians is don't go back to Judaism and keep circumcision as a matter of law. That's pretty much it in Galatians. Not so here. Now, we're not going to take the time to trace all of these references. We'll come to them as we work through this. We're going to have time to do that later in other studies. I'm just going to list the concepts. And then when we come to those, you're going to be reminded, oh yeah, we talked about that when we talked about this Colossian heresy. Well, the doctrine involved philosophy according to chapter 2 and in verse 8. There was an emphasis on being given to philosophy of men as they relied upon wisdom and knowledge of men and not the wisdom and the knowledge of God. And so men are drawn away by philosophy. Philosophers, as we see in Corinthians, that's not the same philosophy. Often philosophers would come and dazzle people with their rhetoric, and if somebody had a little fancier spiel with their rhetoric, they would dazzle them and begin to influence them. Something similar to that's going on at Colossae. Chapter 2 and in verse 18 suggests that there was angel worship, worshiping angels. This morning we talked about worshiping Mary. They're not doing that, but they're worshiping angels. So angels are worshiped as well as God, deity, but they're making deity out of angels. There seemed to be an attack on the supremacy of Christ because great emphasis is given in chapter 1 and then later in chapter 2 that Christ is preeminent in all things. In fact, he spends, for the short book, a great deal of space establishing the deity of Christ. So there seems to be an attack on the supremacy of Christ. And let's look at chapter 1 and verse 18. Having made all of his arguments, his conclusion is that he is preeminent, transcendent in all things. In any relationship, you look at Jesus in his relationship to the Father, to the Son, to the Godhead, or to mankind, or to sinners, or to the world, he comes out transcendent and supreme. So he is preeminent in all things. Well, there is an aspect of this, according to chapter 2, of asceticism. What is asceticism? Asceticism is a practice of rigid and extreme self-discipline to the point that you would deny your body of its needs. Now, you see why that's the case in a moment, but there was that. Antinomianism was a doctrine that involved the freedom from all law and there are no restraints. Well, that seems to be just the opposite. Here is the self-discipline, and then there's the freedom going in any direction. This is kind of a convoluted concept. We see that in chapter 3. There's intellectual superiority dealt with in chapter 1, and then there's the practices of the law of Moses alluded to. For example, there is the Sabbath that is referred to, circumcision in chapter 2, the ordinances, meat and drinks in chapter 2 and verse 16. Those are Jewish ordinances that are addressed. So if you're a little confused, you say, I don't really understand what this Colossian heresy involved. Well, get in line behind me because it is confusing. It is convoluted. There is a great number of elements that are involved. So let's see if we can make some more sense of that. So really, what was this doctrine? Some suggest this is the doctrine of Gnosticism. And others say that it doesn't involve Gnosticism because Gnosticism did not become full-fledged to the 2nd century. That's why some say Paul could not have written this. Somebody wrote it in the 2nd century. Well, really, it's not Gnosticism in the full-fledged, but Gnosticism said all matter is evil. And that creation came by a series of emanations. Sounds very similar to evolution. That is, if God, deity, created the world directly, then that matter, the world he created, is evil. God doesn't create evil. So God had to create something that then evolved to something else, which then changed to something else, which changed to something else, which changed to something else, which changed to something else. And we don't have time to go on and on. And when they finally get down, and then we have matter down here created. So the world came about by a series of emanations. The Son of God did not come in the flesh. That's not possible with Gnosticism. And we see in 1 Timothy and in 1 John some hints at Gnosticism. Now, as Weed suggested in his work on Colossians, that if flesh is evil, all matter is evil, this Gnostic thought. If that's true, then one of these two things are true. Asceticism, which means there must be a rigid denial. Flesh is evil, so there must be the denial of the flesh. You just deny your flesh of anything that it wants, even food, because all matter is evil, all flesh is evil. That desire that you crave to eat after a while when we get through is evil. Or antinomianism, which means you just let everything go. Matter is evil anyway, so any desires you have, just fulfill it and go do it. Those seem to be extremes. Both are dealt with here in the book. But there's a Jewish element there also. There's a reference to the commandments, there's a reference to circumcision and the Jewish rituals of the Sabbath and the eating of meats. So you say, now I'm confused. Which is it? Is it Gnosticism? Well, not full-fledged Gnosticism, but an incipient form of Gnosticism is really what's dealt with that grows full-fledged by the 2nd century, and the Jewish element. So perhaps it's a combination of the two, where some are taking some of the Jewish elements they like and they want, along with the incipient form of Gnosticism, and combining them together. And you say, well, it sounds contradictory. This footnote, error is never consistent. Truth is, error is never consistent. It doesn't have to be consistent. It can be contradictory. We saw that this morning in our study about Roman Catholicism, that it involves some inconsistencies. So error does that. So don't worry about trying to make it harmonize. This is error that we're dealing with, and so perhaps it was a combination of the two. Now bear with a few quotes here, just trying to establish this. I won't read every word of this, but what H.A.W. Meyer, quite a detailed commentator, suggests that what's going on in, and I'm not going to read the entire quote, but it has its historical roots down about 2/3 of the quotation, the historical root in Essenism, and its further development is derived from an elaboration of later Gnosticism. That is, from the Jewish element of the Essenes to combining that with the incipient form of Gnosticism seems to be what this Colossian heresy was about. Everett F. Harrison said, although religion as such could be described as a philosophy of the Hellenistic age, it's probable that we have here a reference to an attempt of fusion of philosophy and a known religion as Gnosticism, which at this stage is not fully developed as it is in the 2nd century. That's what I told you. It was an incipient form thereof. Finley says in the Pulpit Commentary, the time was ripe surely for the birth of Gnosticism, such as we find it in its infant form in this epistle. And again, I quoted from Weed a moment ago, the Colossian heresy evidence curious mixture of both Jewish and Hellenistic religious and philosophical ideas. Well, we see the same thing. Weaver suggests that this Colossian era was an amalgam of Judaism, the Essene type, and paganism, the incipient Gnosticism, and that formed this mystic kind of doctrine. That's what Paul is addressing here. That's the era that's being refuted. So if you can't get your head wrapped around that, then join the club. That's kind of hard to get what all is involved. There was a whole passel of information involved in that Colossian heresy. And this is a short book to address all of that. He's going to deal with every one of those before we get through. Let's talk about the theme and the purpose of the book. What is the theme of the book? If you want to flag that in your text or marker text, I think, though you may want to choose another verse, I like choosing a verse that summarizes the book. Chapter 1, verse 27, Christ in you, the hope of glory. Christ in you, the hope of glory. He talks about the preeminent Christ, chapter 1. He talks about the hope of glory and how we have that hope of glory. So what's the purpose of the book? What's he trying to accomplish? 3 goals seem to be what's going on here in this book. Number 1 is to warn of the era, this Colossian heresy, whatever it is. Epaphras seems to have come and said, look, Paul, the church is doing well, but there's some people teaching some wild, crazy ideas over there and trying to infiltrate the church. And so Paul fires a letter off and gets it over there quickly as he can and warns about this Colossian heresy. Convoluted concepts. Then secondly, he exalts the Christ as preeminent in all things. He does that before he gets to the error. And then thirdly, he encourages faithfulness. You say, I want to study something practical. I wish we'd study something. You're not going to get any more practical than Colossians. We're going to learn about Christ and who He is and what that means. And we're going to learn that we are complete in Him, therefore we ought to be faithful. Chapter 2, our life is hid with Christ. Chapters 3 and 4, therefore we ought to be faithful. You say, I want to hear something about how I need to live. You're going to see that in Colossians. Someone else says, I want to hear about the Christ. You're going to see that in Colossians. Someone else says, I want to see error refuted. You're going to see that in Colossians. There's a lot going on in these 4 short chapters. Now, we're going to conclude by looking at an outline. An outline, in my mind, as you know, captures the thought of the book and summarizes it so that we have, in a nutshell, this is where the book is going. And so let's look at some outlines of the book. Thyssen suggests this. I'm not going to follow this one, but I like sharing outlines that I think capture a good thought. He suggests there are 4 sections to the book. There is the doctrinal section, the polemical section where you argue against error, the practical section, and then the personal section. Well, that's pretty good. I like that. Now this one's a little convoluted, as Hendrickson can be, but notice the highlighted section. He focuses on the all-sufficient Savior as the object of the believer's faith, chapters 1 and 2, and the source of the believer's life, chapters 3 and 4. Here's the Christ, the object of our faith, and the source of our life. 2 points. Well, here's the one we're going to follow. You won't see those others again, but you're going to see this one time and again. This, I think, captures the essence of the book. What is the book of Colossians about? Christ in you, the hope of glory. So we're not going to go through the book tonight, but I'm just going to scan through the concepts. So what we have is the introduction to the book. And that's in chapter 1 to 14. What does he do there? There's thanks for them. I'm thankful for your progress, your growth, and your love. I hear a good report from Epaphras about how things are going and that the word is bringing forth fruit in you. And I'm paraphrasing, of course. I delight to hear the great things going on at Colossae. Wow, the gospel has made a great impact on you. And that's quite obvious. Then here's my prayer for you, that you grow and that you grow in knowledge and you grow in wisdom, and I want you to be fully pleasing to God in every area of your life. And we haven't even got through chapter 1 yet. Then he moves to the preeminent Christ preached to the world. Key to that would be verse 18. He's preeminent in all things. So let's look at Christ in his relationship to the Godhead, in his relationship to the Father, in his relationship to the world that he created, his relationship to the sinner, his relationship to man. He comes out preeminent, transcendent in all things. Then he says we are complete in him, so don't be led away. In other words, you don't need to go anywhere else. Everything you need for your spirituality and living your life, you have in Christ. What else do you need? You're complete in Him. It's not that you have most everything and you might need to go and get this. You have everything you need. So why do you need to go anywhere else? Don't be led away by the error, because you already have everything you need. And then he moves to talk about a life that's hidden with Christ. Here is a life that's hidden with Christ. That's chapter 3 and chapter 4. So in chapter 3, we're going to see things about setting your affections on things that are above, putting on the new man, putting off the old man, the characteristics of the new man. We'll see about obligations in the family, obligations on the job. That's part of this hidden life that's hidden with Christ. And then he concludes with greetings and salutations concerning the brethren there at Colossae. Now we have some ground to cover, and so we'll get to that as time goes. And so next time we're going to focus on chapter 1, verses 1 to 8. So I'd encourage you, before we study next Sunday evening, to read the entire book of Colossians again, as we're trying to do each week, but particularly read verses 1 to 8 a couple of times, and that'll enhance your study. It's Paul's prayer, or his expression, rather, of thanks for the Colossians. What's going on? What made him rejoice over these brethren, and how things were going? That's an introduction to the book of Colossians. Hopefully that's whetted your appetite enough that you're thinking, you know what? I think I'm ready to study that book. I want to see more about the book of Colossians, about Christ in you, the hope of glory. Be back with us next time, and we'll continue with starting with chapter 1, verses 1 to 8. There may be one or more present who's not a Christian, who's not a child of God. Would you come believing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God? Would you repent of your sins, acknowledge your faith, and be buried in the waters of baptism for the remission of sins? If you're subject in any way, would you come while together we stand and sing?